You're listening to Arsenal Pass, a flesh and blood podcast for players by players. And all about strategy, leveling up, and the latest news in the world of Wraith. Welcome to Arsenal Pass.
Welcome back, everyone, to episode 26 of Arsenal Pass. I'm Brendan Patrick, joined always by calling champion Hayden Dale. Hayden, how are you doing?
I'm good, thanks. What's happening, Brendan?
Nothing much. Doing well. So today we'll be discussing drafts. We're going to be diving deep on the basics of how it works, key things you should be doing during your drafts, drafting your seat, reading signals, as well as talking about our personal tips when it comes to Tales of Aria draft. But first, let's talk about your week in Flesh and Blood.
Yeah, let's do it. Week in Flesh and Blood has been good, Brendan. Class constructor testing. Really enjoying this format. It feels really open. There's a lot of heroes that, basically every hero feels viable to some extent. I mean, obviously it's early days of testing, so I'm also just learning about what's happening with how the heroes are currently shaking out. Obviously with Tales of Aria as well, what that kind of means for things. But yeah, no, been enjoying playing a bunch of different decks that I've been sort of working on as well that feel like they have legs, which is it's always fun. And then outside of that, did a draft on Saturday, our weekly draft with some other players that we have online, which was it was good. I went 0-3, so it was not that good, but definitely learned a lot from my draft. I tried a different bit of a different strategy in our draft this week, and definitely did not pay off.
Yeah, it's funny that we announced Hayden's 0-3 as you were about to teach everybody about said draft.
Yeah, it is but there's also a lot of learnings from that. I think it's really interesting. Like, actually, I learned more from my 0-3 draft than I did from my 3-0 draft the week prior. So, I'm actually excited to talk about draft because this format is really deep, first of all, but also a lot of fun and very, very interesting.
Yeah, for sure. So I've also been enjoying Classic Constructed. We've kind of, finally switched over to at least like a half and half for our North American players in our group. We'll do kind of half sealed, half limited stuff, and then swap over to Classic Constructed. And it's funny because it's the first, in Monarch, Classic Constructed definitely felt more like my job, like the thing that I kind of had to do, it was definitely the work. But now I think that Classic Constructed really feels like kind of an escape from Limited. Not that Limited is bad or anything, but just that the format is so open. There's so many different things, and everybody's trying different decks, different strategies. So it's very, very fun, and I've been enjoying it a lot. So I was also a part of said draft recently. I think I went 1-2, but also was trying just some funky strategies, main thing is trying to find archetypes, right? Trying to identify cards and archetypes and classes that are going to be underdrafted to try to shore up the consistency when we get to something like Nationals.
We should re-record the intro and let everyone know that we're now talking draft today with 1-2 and 0-3 drafters, Brendan and Hayden.
Well, the weekend prior, I went 48,000 and 0, so it's okay. Just kidding. Just pulling out some lies like Hayden over here, trying to shore up my record. But no, it's
Wait, what?
You learn a lot. You learn a lot from your losses, and I definitely was drafting intentionally towards a certain strategy, more experimentally than trying to spike our little event.
Yeah, and actually, obviously, a table full of very good players that we have in these drafts, but also some really interesting things that we're going to talk about later on to do with basics of draft, like core fundamentals that sometimes feel like you should move away from some core fundamentals to try and push different things in draft. And actually, we have some good examples from our drafts in the past couple of weeks. So yeah, we're going to talk about it further down. But Brendan, why don't we jump into the news?
Yep. So got to the top of our news here. Big milestone for us. We have hit 2,000 subscribers on YouTube. It's just awesome to kind of see the growth. I remember not too long ago we were at 1,000 and I became a blonde man. I was actually thinking today that I feel like we finally made it when my hair color becomes a marketing expense for Arsenal Pass. So that's really the goal. And I'm hoping Hayden will join me on said, billing said expense soon enough when he does get out of lockdown. But yeah, it's incredible to kind of be at 2,000 now. And it's just been an awesome journey. Like, if we think back to where we were when we started this and just how small we were thinking back then to where we are now and kind of what we're planning for the future, it's just been an incredible journey.
Yep. Lots of exciting stuff on the horizon. Obviously from the YouTube side, we're ramping up with like gameplay videos, deck techs. We did a draft walkthrough this week as well. Don't want to steal your thunder, Brennan. Usually Brennan plugs the videos we do, but yeah, no, it's been a good few weeks. And I actually just thought the other day, I've been in lockdown for the majority of our time doing Arsenal Pass, which is weird because first of all, we've obviously gone through a bit of a longer lockdown, but also it's it's been 4 or 5 months, so it's been an awesome experience so far. So again, just thank you to everyone out there and to all of our awesome Arsenal Pass listeners.
Yeah, that's when you're supposed to say, just lockdown. I wouldn't have been able to do without you, Brendan. Let's go.
That too. Yeah, that too. So. Want to talk about as well. So national championship invites are going out. So we already had the Road to Nationals invites go out. So if you did win or place in a Road to Nationals, make sure you check your emails because LSS have sent those out to the winners and place getters in Road to Nationals for your invites. And you do need to go and accept the invite in order to make sure you get it. So make sure you go and get that done. But also 90-day XP. So they have now released the list of 90-day XP invitation getters to Nationals. Sorry, I almost said Road to Nationals. To Nationals. So you can go and check that out if you're on the list. Exciting times. Everyone who had been sort of like grinding a bit, playing locals, playing as many Road to Nationals as possible to get that XP. If they weren't able to make those top fours, I'm sure you've probably made it. And congratulations to you that have your invite to Nationals. It's only a few weeks before Nationals start kicking off. I think 3 weeks before our first Nationals, which is probably, I think it's a European Nationals that kicks us off. Might be Germany, or the UK is very early on as well. So yeah, exciting times.
So I know that not that I know, but I'm actually asking you now. So New Zealand and Australian Nationals, those were pushed back, right?
Yeah, so New Zealand Nationals is officially postponed. That was meant to be the first weekend of Nationals, so the end of this month. New Zealand are in a like a semi-lockdown state in some cities. So although it looks like they're coming out of those, I don't think it's going to be in time for them to run their Nationals in the planned weekend. So it looks like they're being pushed back to, at this stage, looks like sometime in November. So interestingly, I guess the event that many of the players around the world would probably look to as the first event to sort of a bit of a test for the metagame where things might start to shake out. Now that ends up being a little bit later, and it looks like some European Nationals will be the first that we get. And then, of course, US Nationals in early November, right, Brennan? Second weekend in November is US Nationals.
Yeah, it is crazy to think. It's going to be a big event. I mean, obviously Vegas was huge, but Nationals and all that brings, an event at that scale, so, as premier as it is, it's going to be incredible. And I think really sets us up to kick off the Pro Tour in 2022. Yeah,
super exciting. And then, from the Australian side, from my side over here, we looks like, and actually really excitingly, LSS have been committed to running the national champs. We missed out last time as well in 2020, just due to like some states within the country being locked down. Just ongoing, right? But it's going to be looking like we get nationals probably in January at this stage. So we will have nationals over here, which is exciting. Just won't be for a little bit. But we'll take whatever we can get. Other topics on the news this week. So there's some really cool articles up on FabTCG around drafting. So obviously we're talking about limited today, but you can also go and check out some FabTCG articles written by the developers around the archetypes of the current heroes in Tales of Aria limited. So you've got Jason Chung, one of the lead developer, wrote one on Briar, which is really cool. So I recommend going and checking those out if you're looking for a bit of an idea of like archetypes, key cards, things like that. We're going to talk more fundamentals today, so I think those are really great sort of pieces that after you listen to this, you can probably go and check those out and gain some really good information. A pretty exciting, piece of news is that Star City Games, who we already know have been, jumping on Flesh and Blood. They've been selling Flesh and Blood since Monarch, but are now jumping on with events. So SCG, they're now running their first event, I think in basically 2 years. They have their SCG Con, which is like their big sort of marquee event coming up, and Flesh and Blood is going to be there. So that's super exciting. Not only is it this time a Magic event, but it is also a Flesh and Blood event. They have events running all weekend long, so if you are in the Virginia area in the US, or you just want to go and check it out, if you're in the US, I couldn't recommend more going in and checking it out. They've got drafts, they've got some, they've got a PTI as well, a Pro Quest. So that's gonna be the first Pro Quest outside of a calling, I believe, which is or in North America anyway. So which is super exciting.
Yeah, and on that note, this week's Time in the Round features SEG writer and broadcaster Brian Gottlieb, who recently dived headfirst into Flesh and Blood and talks to us about his journey and why he truly loves the game as a veteran TCG player. It's a really interesting conversation. I'd check it out.
Yeah,
If that's something you're interested in. Go ahead.
Tons of fun recording that one. Brian is someone who, coming from a Magic background, I've listened to for a long time with his podcasts and his work on like the SCG tour and his writing. So it was great to have him on, and really really interesting to see just how into Flesh and Blood he is getting, because he definitely is.
And what would be the news without a shout out to the people that make this all possible? Our almost 200 patrons so far. It's just been amazing to see the support, and it keeps growing and growing every day, which is very, very encouraging. If you are interested, we do host a lot of exclusive content on our Patreon. We have extra podcasts every month. We do live sessions in addition to that, where it's kind of a podcast where the patrons are able to participate, ask questions, all that good stuff. And as well, when we throw up deck techs on Arsenal Pass, we have additional content on the Patreon, such as the written out sideboard guide, deck theory, overall strategies as well. And then we go into kind of the math on the ratios of the deck, whether that's the resource base, the non-tech actions versus tech actions, pretty much everything you need to kind of pick up the deck and start being competitive. And then past that, we had our sealed deck video go up on the YouTube channel. So if you're prepping for a calling or any kind of big event coming up that's sealed, I recommend checking it out. Just run through the cards and it's talk about some stuff that maybe is a little bit off people's radars. So I think you could pick up some value. And then we also had a Viserai versus Dash gameplay go up, which I was actually very, very happy with how it turned out. The Viserai list is very, very cool, very spicy, and I think a potential contender as we head into the national seasons here.
Yeah, it's also super fun to play. It's been one of the first decks that I built up post Tales of Aria, and it's the deck that I'm probably still having the most fun playing. So yeah, recommend it both as a pretty strong list, but also just a ton of fun. And who doesn't love Viserai?
Mm-hmm. And speaking of gameplay, go ahead and shoot us a comment in the YouTube video here, or anywhere else of what kind of heroes you would like to see us play. Obviously we are prioritizing newer heroes, but sometimes we're just jumping on some of the heroes that got a lot of tools, or maybe they're going to be performing well since the meta opened up after the Seeds of Agony banning. Mm-hmm. So if you've got something in mind you really want to see, whether it's Ice Lexi, Earth Briar, or maybe that infamous Oldhim deck, let us know. We'll see if we can get it up.
Yep, and Brendan isn't afraid to play Azalea, so if you do want to see Brendan on Azalea with Seek and Destroy, let us know.
Anyway, let's head into the Command and Cookout section, Hayden.
Yeah, let's do it. So we're back again 2 weeks in a row, Command and Cookout section as well, and truly, back in the zeitgeist of everyone's mind. So we actually have a great question this week. So we have a question from John Franey, who is another long-time listener, and John's question is. Actually, I'm just going to read his email. It says, "Hey guys, love the pod and everything you put on YouTube. I'm curious as to what your thoughts have been about Briar. Both in Classic and Blitz constructive formats, it seems early to pass judgment, but in my brief testing, she's already pretty impressive. There are so many generic and Runeblade non-attack actions you can jam in the deck with Go Again for free that each turn can be super explosive with no real downside. Have we found this to be true? Has my testing been lacking?" John asks. "I have found hand disruption like an old time to be somewhat effective at shutting her down, but not consistently. Which leads to my second question. Is Runeblade at its fundamental design space bad for the game? Perhaps too much of a hot take, but I'll let you tackle it if you want. Don't worry, John. We won't shy away from hot takes. Again, thanks so much for Arsenal Pass and putting out all the content you do for the community. It's very much appreciated. Thank you for your question, John. And you know what? I think this is actually, I wanted to discuss Runeblade because obviously we've had now Brendan, right? We've had 3 Runeblades in Classic Constructor. We've obviously had Viserai first, and Chain, and now Briar. So obviously Runeblade is a marquee class of this game, right? I think I've said it before, and I think it's pretty obvious at this point just to how much a degree that is true. It's a design space that is super interesting. It's a class that LSS have said is a big part of the Wraith world. So whether that be from Aria, from the Demonastery, there is lots of Runeblades running around in different shapes and forms. But great question. First of all, let's talk about just Briar in general in this new format. What are your sort of first impressions, Brendan, on Briar in this Classic Constructor format?
It's funny because I think that from what I actually see on Twitter is that a lot of people think that Briar is not very good. And it was actually even before we had time to test it. I remember in kind of the early phase, people were definitely writing the character off. In terms of what I've seen, yeah, it's really, really powerful. I think both builds, actually, both Earth and Lightning, have shown to be very powerful in our group. But so far, we've actually been able to find decks that are just straight up Kryptonite for it, that it's lost very consistently to, especially the Lightning side of it. Still in early days there, but while it seems to be, for me, it's probably the most attractive deck out of the Tales of Aria heroes. Like, it's looking really good. I mean, Runeblade just classically attacking off the two axes of, physical damage and arcane. It's just a good place to be a lot of the time. But with Briar specifically, it seems like the kind of damage output you can have with this somewhat linear game plan is very, very big. So I'm liking it in the early meta right now, but will it be kind of flexible enough and resilient enough? Like, I think that's an important question, is resilience, to maintain a dominance or kind of, let's say, a foothold in the meta as we move forward.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think like the early sort of days of this new meta, one of the things that we really see, and this is the same in every meta at the start, is that I think decks with linear plans tend to do better earlier on. We see people, it's much easier to adopt a plan, to play it into games. And if you're not, I guess, you're obviously always adapting as the game goes on, you're adapting to turn cycles and situations. But if you're not actually, physically and very much so changing the game plan depending on matchup to matchup, I think we see less of that early on because it's more difficult to do, and it's not clear that you should do that in certain matchups because probably haven't played against that deck multiple times, don't know what the sort of core lists are going to look like from different heroes. So Briar on the Lightning and Earth side has some really cool things that it can do. That is a bit more linear in game plan, but is also just quite explosive as well, which is no matter what hero is playing into, which is really cool. And I think that is a bit of a tenet of the Runeblades, which we will talk a bit more about Runeblade in a second, just as a class, but I think we will see that sort of shift. And to Brendan's point, there is, there's things that Briar doesn't do well in this format already, doesn't block very well. You could say Embodiment of Earth is like a good way to defend, but if we're talking about the Lightning decks, if you're playing Ball Lightnings, things like this, and if you're able to stop the Embodiment of Earths, often they're not going to be able to defend well in the second cycle, on the next turn cycle, which is important. A good way to attack it. So there's definitely ways to attack these decks. It's just being conscious of like what their weaknesses are. I think running other linear game plans into Briar, which in probably early days has as we said, very linear game plans, might not be the way to do it, right? So it might be ways that you need to attack it a bit differently. But I think that's the same for so many of the classes in this game, especially like we say week 1, week 2, week 3, where the game plans are going to be just pretty explosive, pretty I guess adapted to just trying to present big damage and try and push through those sort of early game turns. So yeah, I think it's an interesting one with Briar. I think it's a lot better than people gave it credit for initially when the hero was released. To what extent it becomes, as a hero in this format in the new meta, we'll have to see. What
now
about
to the real question?
Yeah. I'll let you lead, Brendan. So I guess, I did preface a little bit about what Runeblade means to LSS, and at least it's a big part of that is my interpretation, but also just the things that LSS have said as well. So it's not just, I'm not just making it up or just rambling. This is definitely things they've said about the design space of the game, that Runeblade is one of their sort of, I guess, key pillars of that.
Yeah, so to answer this question, I feel like the context of this question is kind of chain-based, right? Like we never really saw like a Viscerai dominance, but we did see a chain dominance. And I think that chain's issues weren't Runeblade based. They were more like pseudo dredge based, right? Like using this kind of zone to have massive card advantage. And if you employed the correct strategy, to have inevitability versus control and fatigue, or just game plans that weren't proactive. And that deck, I don't think it was a Runeblade problem. And I think I've talked about this for like a long time regarding chain and the issues that I had with the class. And I would go even farther to say that not only was it not a Runeblade problem, but it was also not a Shadow Runeblade problem. It was literally just a chain problem and the hero ability, which is why I thought Living Legend would kind of solve the problem. But it looks like we gotta fix a little bit faster. So the class in general, I don't think is like a fundamental kind of design issue. It is interesting in the way that it does kind of it has like a hyper efficient way of utilizing both axes, which makes it hard to block against. But but it does suffer a lot of downsides for being able to do something like that. So my short answer is like, no, I don't think that it, the class in general, like the generic class Runeblade is a problem for the game. But so far the Runeblades we were presented with one Runeblade that was very, very good. And then the others, we'll kind of see where they land.
Yep. I agree with that. My answer would be yes and no. So I think that the design space of Runeblade is really cool. I think it's such a good thing for the game to have the utilization of the two sort of, two of the key pieces of the world of Wraith with, physical combat damage and then arcane damage, and for that to be entwined and to be done. And I think, for all three of the Runeblades, they actually feel different, which is really cool, which is hard to do from a design space and design element. In saying that, though, I think it's something that they need to be really careful of because of the dual system of damage, right? And I think, we can go back and forth. And to be honest, Brendan, I'm kind of just sick of talking about Chain. But, you could say probably they got it wrong, right? So they do need to be careful about how they balance Runeblade heroes and the class of Runeblade, especially as they release more Runeblade class cards into the environment where previous Runeblades can pick up and play those class cards. But in saying that, I still do think it's, I think that it's not bad for the game. I don't think it's a bad design space for the game, to John's question. I think it's one that needs to be managed, and if it's done correctly, it's not only really, really cool, can be really fun, but it's just really unique. So yeah, I think that's kind of my answer to that question.
I actually really like it, though. I think the game would feel like it was kind of missing something without it, because like I love the idea of Kano, but having like a middle ground, right? Is really cool, especially from a casual standpoint. I love it. But even from a competitive, so far I've enjoyed it. But I guess kind of my final answer is like I do genuinely think it's good for the game.
Yeah, it changes the way that the game needs to be played, and that's a good thing, right? It actually takes away from, although I said that we look at Briar and maybe early in the format it feels quite linear with its plan. The actual the damage isn't linear, right? So the way that decks probably end up needing to play into that, I don't think they can be. It actually forces interaction and for people to play differently because you're having, to your point, damage on two axes, right? So there's decisions to be made about how you cover that damage, about which damage is important to you, and different decks can focus on different sources of damage even within the Runeblade sort of family. So I think this is like a really important part of the game, and I'm glad we have it. It just needs to be, it just comes down to how that gets worked into and from a design space aspect. But I think Briar is a pretty cool way to do that with the dual elements and the ways that you can build the hero differently. And then of course, Viserai. I'm a big Viserai fan. I think there's still something there with Viserai, and is also just really fun to play.
Awesome. Well, why don't you take us into the main topic of the pod, Hayden?
Yep, let's do it. Just wanted to say, if you do want to get your questions in for the Command and Cookout, please do. Flick them through to arsenalpassfab@gmail.com. That's arsenalpassfab, one word, @gmail.com. We'll be back next week with more Command and Cookout. And Brendan has promised to do, a nice saucy intro to the section next week. All right, Brendan. This week we are talking about drafting, as we said at the top of the show, and it's a big one for me. I think limited is such an interesting part of Flesh and Blood. I guess the focus really has been on Classic Constructed, right, and Blitz Constructed. Like that's the early life of this game, yeah. Like it's been the focus, really. But this game is purposefully balanced and purposely designed for limited play as well. It's a big focus of what LSS do as a company. It's been one of the cornerstones of this game since release. When they released Welcome to Wraith, they immediately said this game is also, is heavily designed for limited. It's a big focus for us, and that hasn't changed through the sets releasing. Unfortunately, we had less opportunity to play limited just due to circumstances. That's very difficult to play that when install play isn't as possible, and it just has been. I guess the way that the game has gone, the focus has been more so on the constructive formats. But we have 2 limited callings coming up, right? And then we also have draft and nationals. And then no doubt next year, as we move through new sets coming out, we're going to see more and more limited, which personally for me, and Brendan and I think you're the same, is limited is my favorite format.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely was my favorite format. I still think it is, but I have definitely found an affinity for Flesh and Blood Constructed that I didn't have in other games.
Yeah.
So while I still love Limited, it's got a competitor these days.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's one of the things about Limited, right, is that it is so fundamentally different to Constructed. Cards operate differently. Cards have different levels of importance. They do different things in your deck. It's more of like, you're playing basically micro games when you show up to your event on a Saturday. You don't come with your deck. You are building your deck, whether it be through sealed or draft. You are coming up with your strategies as you go, and there's archetypes for sure, and there's certain cards that are always going to be good. But a card that doesn't make your deck one week might make your deck the next week and be an all-star, for instance, and that's kind of the cool thing about Flesh and Blood's limited design. So for today on the pod, we're going to be talking about the key, one of the key parts of limited, and that is being draft, that we're going to see in nationals. We're going to see it in skirmish in season 3 with a select number of stores being allowed to run draft skirmishes, which is really cool. We're going to be talking about fundamentals, talking about sort of a mix of examples as well with the new format, where we have been able to draft Tales of Aria, which is fantastic, and then just talk a bit about I guess our tips for drafting and how to really get some success in drafting and find a strategy that works for you. Mm-hmm. So Brendan, thought we'd start. We'll just take it back to basics a little bit. I'm sure most of the listeners to Arsenal Pass would have done a draft before, but due to opportunity, a lot of people haven't been able to draft yet, and this sort of season will be the first time that they do get to draft, or maybe they've only just done their first sort of drafts in the past few weeks with the release of Tales. So just wanted to quickly talk about what a draft is. So draft is 8 players at a table. Each player gets 3 packs, and you're going to be cracking those packs one by one and passing the cards around the table until you end up with 15 cards in front of you from pack 1. So you're going to see your pack back a second time. It's going to go around the table twice. And then you're going to do that 2 more times for the next 2 packs. And, one of the cool things in designs about the draft format, and this is the same for every TCG majority, is that you'll also be changing direction. So you'll pass to your left in pack 1, but then to your right in pack 2, and back to your left in pack 3, which does create a lot of really cool things, which we're going to talk about with signaling and drafting your seat later on. In between each of the packs, you're also going to have time to review your drafts. So, after you've picked your first 15 cards, you've made your selection for the first pack, before you head into the second pack at the table, you're going to give time to review your first 15 cards. And this gives you time to work out, where am I so far? What are the class cards that I've taken? What are the generics or element cards that I've taken? And where is my draft going right now? Where are my weaknesses? Where am I lacking? What are the cards that are, probably going to be good for me? Where are some of the ones that maybe I can't play because I've drafted across 2 classes so far? And then, yeah.
I do have a question for you though, Hayden. So when you play drafts casually at your locals or wherever, do you treat it like a professional event where you'll review only in between, or do you kind of review openly? Because I just want to say this because at most events that are not professional events, you're actually allowed to kind of, well, I don't know if you're allowed, but everybody does it. They review in between. And I've actually recently switched to only reviewing after I fully drafted, just to kind of, keep myself more practiced for when it actually matters at a calling or something like that.
So Brendan's talking about like picking up the cards you've already drafted in between picks. So
say
you've taken your first 4 cards and then you pick up and check what those first 4 cards are because you've forgotten or whatever. I think most casual drafts are okay with this. The one thing you got to be careful of, right, is like don't have the pack in your hand while also looking at your picks. Like if there's no packs, either side of you, then you're probably fine to pick up and have a look at your cards. It's always good to find out from like the TO. Usually they'll say like, it's casual. You can look at your cards. Just make sure there's no other cards around you when you do it, whatever it might be. Personally, I prefer just to not look. Let's just treat it. Yeah, exactly. I'm there to practice draft. So I'm going to practice like I would. If it was a draft at nationals or a calling or wherever it is where you don't have the opportunity to review your picks until the end of each pack, which is also just good practice for getting into that mindset of remembering to some degree what cards you're taking, what is the path your draft has taken so far, because it's really if you could review each pick as you take it and continue looking at that, it's going to be a lot easier. And if anyone's ever played online draft clients for TCGs, that draft experience is so much different to a real life draft experience where you can't be doing that.
100%.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of that's the basics of draft, right? I'm sure most people have drafted, but did just want to recap in case any of our listeners out there haven't had the opportunity to draft yet. Why don't we start, Brendan, by just talking about some of like the core fundamentals, right? Some of the things that are really important for draft, things that you should always remember, and actually just practice and try and hone your craft on these sort of fundamentals if you aren't already. And first one, I know this is one that you always point the finger at me on, but it is important no matter who you are, and it's ratios, right? So considering your ratios is really important. Right, Brendan, you can't get to the end of the draft and work out, I only have 4 or 5 blues. It's not going to go too well for you, right?
Yeah, you definitely can't. The only reason I point at you is I just think you're better at it than I am. But there's an interesting concept when drafting too. It's this might be kind of taking the basic concept and taking it to the advanced, but it does seem like you are able to secure. You do want to secure reds earlier in the draft while you do get your resource base later. But that can also lead to an issue where it's like, I don't have enough blues. And if you're playing something, that requires that, like we can think Bravo and Welcome to Wraith, or maybe Oldheim in this one, that can be pretty devastating, is not being able to have the resource core if you need to play out your deck.
Yeah, when we talk ratios, right, we're not just talking about the amount of blues in your deck. We're also talking about how many blues versus how many yellows versus how many reds you need. And like a really cool, like a really good thing that you should do, I think, before you go into any draft, and it's really easy to do, no matter the format you're drafting, no matter the set you're drafting, is just know roughly for each of the heroes, like what ratios you do want. So, if we look at Tales of Aria, obviously current set, I'm going to the draft thinking, well, most heroes I want like, 6 to 9 blues in my deck, somewhere around there. But Oldtime, I want more. I want, 12 to 15 blues probably in that deck. And, in some certain Lexi or Briar decks, I can maybe get away with less blues, maybe that like 6 to 7 mark, depending on what my deck looks like, my cost structure looks like. So that's just like we can go into that, but that's like a rough rule of thumb, is like I know around that many blues. At 8 blues, you're just shy, about a quarter of your deck, right? Or just yeah.
I actually do look for a little bit more blues on Lexi, just so that you can kind of have the ability to, just it depends what deck you're in, but there is like a very good play pattern where it's like flip the lightning card, like the Heaven's Claws, then load, cost 1 resource and play the arrow. So I actually tend to be a bit more blue on Lexi than I do on like Briar. But the really interesting thing with this format is like, how does deep blue affect your blue ratios? Because I think if you have deep blue, you're actually able to skimp like quite a bit, like almost 2 to 3. Like if I have a base that I want, like let's say in Briar I want like 7, maybe I want sometimes creeping up to 10 blues. Like I'll go down to like 6. I don't know if I go down to 5, but like I'll be happy at like 6 if I have deep blue, because deep blue is just a blue on demand, right? So when you do have that one turn where you kind of don't draw it because your ratios don't allow you to have one in every single hand, like I think that deep blue's impact on your resource base is massive.
And this is where you see immediate divergence from myself and Brendan on opinion in this format. I think Deep Blue is like one of the best cards in the format, and we are getting to the weeds a little bit, but I still don't think that you can really skimp too hard on resources at the expense of that, just because of just how you're likely to draw resources over the game in your hands. But I think there's kind of, I guess a matter of like in-depth sort of Tales of Aria drafting in itself, as opposed to maybe some of the fundamentals. So I do think as well, to your point, I do think you want more blues in Lexi if we're talking about this format. I think that's definitely true. Briar can get away with using yellows a bit more for resources, especially in lightning builds. You've got cards that cost 0, etc., etc. But I guess the kind of main thing is that, you head into that draft with a rough idea of where you want to sit, and which cards are going to be important to you. So that's where I guess ratios come from, and then not just blues, right? So reds. Probably want roughly half my deck to be reds. That's kind of a starting point. Less probably for Oldtime, for instance. Briar probably, around that. So it's just a kind of a rough starting point, and you can work from there. But what that's going to allow you to do is, as you go through the draft, allow those ratios to guide you. Early on, definitely better to take high power cards, right? That's gonna, because those cards are gonna be premiums. So we're talking about, reds and other high power cards, maybe some yellow as well. And then as the draft goes on, then you're starting to look to fill out your curve, right? Your ratio curve, your resource curve. And that's when you might start to consider blues. But for Oldtime, right, some blue cards might come at more of a premium than for, say, Briar, right, which we just talked about. So a blue Glacial Footsteps, for instance, could be like really high priority because it's It's a blue, but it's also, and it costs 3 or more, so it's going to trigger your weapon. But it's also a card that late game you can actually utilize as a very strong win condition. So, there's definitely some aspects to go through in terms of ratios there. Anything on your side, Brendan, outside of like blues and ratios?
Well, I mean, if we're going to talk about Glacial Footsteps being kind of a solid blue that has a high function in the deck, I think like Blue Ball Lightning is the epitome of that, where that is a functional blue to pitch, but is probably one of the best ball lightnings you can have, just because how annoying it is to block, right?
Yeah, and the fact that you can pitch it if needed, you can get it on the second cycle of your deck, all these things. So, yeah, agree. One thing we haven't talked about from a ratio standpoint, we've talked about our resource ratio, but in this set, you have another kind of ratio, which is your fuse to element ratio, right? Which is, I think we're probably going to just keep this pretty surface level for this pod. We could probably do a whole podcast just on your ratios of fuse versus element cards. It's a really interesting part of this format. And it's something that's very deep depending on which hero you're in, which element you're in, and which cards you're actually playing with fuse. But the base kind of level is that whatever in this format, whatever in Tales of Aria, whatever element that you end up sort of primarily drafting, because even if you're in a hero and you are drafting across the 2 elements, you're probably still going to primarily be in one element, is that you want to work out when to prioritize those element cards and the cards that you need. So if you're playing half the deck with cards that say fuse on them, you're going to need some elements to back that up, right? And it's going to probably depend on the strength of your fuse cards. But if you say that maybe 4 to 5 of my fuse cards are really key, then how can I reliably fuse these across the game? You're probably going to want sort of minimum 6 to 8 element cards of whatever combination of elements that looks like for your hero. But it is something important to keep in mind.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how not equal fuse cards are. Like some are significantly better than others, and you see them kind of go very quickly at the table. But yeah, I think that I almost feel like I draft an element before hero, and I think that having the solid base in whatever element I'm playing, and sometimes it is dual element, I find, but just rarely is probably the most important part of drafting, because if you end up drafting all class cards, your deck is actually close to unplayable. Or if you draft all element cards, you could have a pretty solid deck.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think mostly true. Yeah, I think definitely true on the first one. And I will say that if I'm aiming for, say, and I want to give a bit of like a kind of an easy rule of thumb, but if you're aiming for like a quarter to a third of your cards being element cards in your draft, which I think is a pretty reasonable ratio to be on, since we're talking about ratios right now, that shouldn't come at the expense of putting bad cards into your deck where possible. So putting bad element cards into your deck just for the sake of fuse, and they do no other job in your deck. They're not a resource. They don't defend well. They don't pose a threat. Those cards are really difficult to justify. So while ratios with resources, red, yellow, blues. Actually, this is, to be honest, it's the same thing. I'm not going to be putting reds into my deck just to get to my deck to half red if it's a bad card that's not going to do anything for me. I'd probably rather just play another resource card or another yellow card or whatever it might be. And it's the same for elements, to be honest. I'm not going to just shoehorn in cards that are actively going to make my deck worse just to potentially have a slightly higher percentage on some of my fuse cards.
Mm-hmm. And there is there is kind of like a third little thing you have to pay attention to in terms of ratios, but mostly when it comes to Brian, that's non-attack versus attack action. Obviously your archetype could somewhat guide this, but definitely something to keep in mind, because you will see, I feel like in Tales of Aria, you do see the premium non-attacks go really quickly, like the red Electrifies, the red Earthlore Surges, the Weavers. They seem to just get picked up very quickly.
Yeah. Agree. Yeah, so if we took this kind of back to, I guess, just like the core fundamental of ratios, when you walk into a draft, have an idea of the heroes in the set and kind of roughly what ratios you want for those heroes. It's going to help you as you start to move into a hero, into a class with where you want to be, especially as you get into packs 2 and 3. Pack 1, I think you can be pretty much just unfocused on it entirely. You don't need to worry about it. Just worry about taking good cards and powerful cards and starting to form a strategy, and we'll talk about that soon. But once you get into packs 2 and 3, start to think about those ratios. And as we go through different formats in Flesh and Blood, different sets, there's going to be other ratios to consider as well, like Brennan just talked about, non-attacks versus attack actions in some decks, elements versus elemental cards in a format like Tales of Aria. So you're going to see this keep going. There will always be ratios outside of your outside of your resources. We even saw some Monarch, right, with like Levia, with your 6 attack ratio versus non-6 attack ratio, or Blood Debt. So yeah, it's not gonna end here. The design space is going to continue to explore different ratios. It's a key part of the resource system in this game, and don't expect it to stop anytime soon. What are we talking about next, Brendan?
Yeah, so it's just how will you win the game. I think that this was a concept that was more prevalent in Monarch. In Tales of Aria, I do find that I will look for synergies more than I'll look for a kind of a specific, set of cards that I'm going to set up to win the game. Whether, examples of this in Monarch would be like the V for the Vanguard that I'm going to set up for a big turn, or, pitch my deck on Chain to kind of set up for Seeds of Agony into Riftbind, all kinds of stuff like that. In Tales of Aria, I find myself very much centered around kind of how do I build a synergy that's going to apply consistent pressure so I can keep tempo, and that's how I plan to win the game. But still, they're kind of two sides of the same coin, right? Like we're approaching the problem with the same way, where it's like, if we're going to be building a deck kind of from scratch here, how does a deck ultimately win? Because most of the time in most higher level games of Flesh and Blood, you don't really win on accident. So you're going to need these kind of key ideas of like how your cards work together and how they're ultimately going to present, enough damage throughout the game that you can close it out, right?
100%. One of the beauties of, or one of the most beautiful things about this game, I guess, sounds a bit cliche, but is the fact that you can often see like a stronger pool of cards a weaker pool of cards do a lot better into a stronger pool of cards because the deck is more cohesive. There's more synergy there. The cards work better together. The ratios are better. And that's the big part of Flesh and Blood, right? Is this draft process and this deck building process in Sealed is actually, it's pretty, it's not straightforward, and there is a lot of angles to it. There's a lot of skill involved with it. And you see that with, just how do you win the game? So, if you are trying to draft just the best cards at your table and you say you end up in, let's say old time, and you just draft the best old time cards and some fuse cards, that doesn't mean that you're going to have the best deck or that you're going to guarantee to win your games. You need to work out like what are your actual win conditions, like as you're drafting. So I'm going to use old time as an example. I see a red glacial footsteps early. Maybe I pick that up, and that is one of my win conditions. I'm going to play for a glacial footsteps in my deck, and that's one of the ways I can win the game late. I could potentially defend well early and set up a red glacial, an arsenal until I find the fuse card plus the blues to do it. I could also see, multiple just really strong 3 cost, 7 attack reds, and I take those in my all-time deck. And my strategy is really focused around presenting 2-card hands, so defending with 2 cards and then coming back in for 7 with a 2-card hand with one of these 7 attacks. And that could be one of the ways that I'm planning to win the game, is to leak damage over time and defend really efficiently. And maybe I combine those two. Maybe I combine those 2 win conditions. So early on, I put pressure on with these 7 attacks and defend with 2 cards, leak damage, get a life total advantage, and then I set up a big dominate attack where I take a swing from my opponent to do it. So, there is lots of different ways to set up win conditions, right, and how to win games.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Anything else to say on winning games? I think that just the main thing is like, no matter what the class is, no matter which hero you end up drafting or which element in this game, for Tales of Aria specifically, you want to have in your head, like, as I'm going through, what are some of the key ways I could be shaping up some win cons here? Lexi kind of has Dominate inbuilt, so it could even be as easy as being like, well, I just need to get to that point where my Dominate arrows are really effective with on-hit effects. So, I'm in an ice deck that can produce a lot of on-hit effects because I'm prioritizing Ice Fuse or whatever it might be.
Yeah, I think that definitely sums it up at a base level.
Mm-hmm. We're gonna talk about. We've kind of talked around this a little bit already, but I wanted to say, Brendan, drafting a class or hero or element is really important. You can't just take the best cards, right? First of all, you need to have a 30-card deck, and so if you're just taking the best cards, say all of pack 1 and half of pack 2, and you end up spread across 4 classes. You're almost certainly not going to end up with enough playables, especially because the last few picks at your table, you could very likely end up with cards that you can't play. Just the way these packs are skewed. If you end up in one of the heroes that has multiple drafters, you could end up, trying to draft Briar, but you end up getting past Ranger cards late, and those cards aren't playable, of course, in your deck. So you need to be conscious of drafting a class, a hero, an element, whatever it might be in the given set, rather than just drafting purely the best cards. But I do want to caveat that a little bit. Whereas early on in a draft, I think it's perfectly acceptable to draft the best cards in the pack. I think you could go picks 1 to 5, just drafting the best card in the pack every single time, and then work out where you want to go from there. I don't think that's an issue, right? But once you get towards the end of pack 1, into pack 2, and if you're not coherently drafting, maybe in Tales of Aria, an element or a class, you're going to find yourself in a bit of trouble, right?
I agree with that in this set more than the last set,
Mhm.
kind of drafting the most powerful card. But you did mention that you could get spread out, spread across 4 heroes. It is actually going to be 3 in Tales of Aria. One thing I do want to say, Tales, is that this set is where I've seen the most cracked baubles. It's just you really like this idea of like trying to stay as open as possible can just become such a trap like so quickly. Because like you have to have you can only have 15 unplayable cards, and assume you have 3 or 4 pieces of armor, like ideally 4, right? It's only like 11 unplayable cards, and like that can get really spicy really quick. Because if you're like, okay, I'm gonna stay open into ice and like ice and earth, and then you end up getting cut out of ice, you could have like 5 ice cards, and then end up getting past like the blue rejuvenates later and like all this crap. So I in this format specifically, I really like to kind of spread out across elements, and obviously I'll take an amazing class card if I see it, but spread out across all 3 really early and just try to read the drafts, because 99% of the, I can't really say 99 because it's not a huge sample size, but really people tend to draft the element class cards early, to kind of have this idea of staying open, and that's where you'll get your early signals. And if you're trying to get class signals super early in like a pack 1, you won't. Like I don't even know if you'll know what class the person is next into to like the last few picks of pack 1, and even if that. So I've actually adjusted my strategy because I was getting owned by doing that. Seeing like a bunch of good ice cards, be like, yeah, ice is open, then it gets super cut from me later, and then I ended up with maybe 30 playable cards. So nowadays I do kind of just pick the best element cards I can. If there is a stellar class card, I'll go ahead and do that. This is for the first 5 or so picks.
Yeah, which I think is like a good strategy, right? I do think that if we talk about Tails specifically, drafting class cards can potentially be a little bit of a trap, and that's because the class cards are generally going to have one direction, right? So they'll either be, let's use Briar, they're either going to be Earth or Lightning. So if you take all these really good Briar cards early, and then afterwards you go, oh, okay, actually I've got like 8 good Briar fuse cards, but only 3 Briar Earth fuse cards. I'm going to go into Lightning. But actually, turns out the person to my left is like heavily drafting Lightning, and I'm going to see no good Lightning cards in pack 3. Lightning element cards to fuse with. That's going to be a big problem. So getting into these elements as opposed to the class cards early is, can really advantage you. It's the same in any other format. You look at Monarch as well. You can do that as well. So rather than committing to a class early on, you can take generics, which we don't have in Tales of Aria, but you could, we have elemental cards. But you could also take shadow or light cards, right? And you're still open to 2 classes, but you are keeping your options open in terms of what ends up being open. So if it feels like, yeah, there's some good shadow cards coming around, I'll pick up some of these and then work out which class I go into afterwards once I sort of feel what one might be open. Mm-hmm. And with like Tails, it's the same thing. To Brennan's point, maybe Brennan takes 5 ice cards. He starts to see some like good Lexi cards, and he thinks like this could be a go. And then all of a sudden, Lexi kind of dries up and Lightning really dries up. Well, Brennan still has his ice cards. He's still open to old time. It's not like he's completely closed off to... the elements still allow you to draft into 2 different classes. So I agree. I think you can definitely draft into elements and it really pay you off. And I think you don't necessarily have to draft across all 3, right? Like it could be across 2 to sort of hedge going into... so
Definitely.
maybe you draft ice and earth, right? A little bit early on, you take a couple of good ice cards, a couple of good earth cards. You're really open to old time at that point. But if the ice dries up and Lexi isn't a thing, you've got some good earth cards, maybe some good lightning comes around, you can pivot into Briar.
I do tend to diversify into all 3 for like the first few.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Well, it's just because I was finding it was like, okay, let's say I was drafting ice and earth, and then like I have an earth card, I have like 2-3 ice cards, and then like really good ice cards just start coming, and I end up getting like into that 5 range of ice cards. But it turns out like it's actually going to drive completely. Oldhim is taken, and Lexi's also taken by the person next to them. And I just kind of have this like 1 or 2 Earth cards, and now I have to also get into Lightning or kind of fully draft Earth, which might also be be cut. Where I kind of like to spread it out a little bit. I generally, so like my past strategy has always been to stay into the 2, but I think nowadays after seeing how low I would get unplayable sometimes, I'm probably going to be spreading out across all 3 and just taking the most powerful card in the pack for the first 5 to 6.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's perfectly reasonable to hedge your bets, and probably everyone's going to have slightly different strategies. But I think in this set in particular, you can get really punished for committing to class cards early because, to Brendan's point, people aren't going to prioritize them highly. They're going to prioritize the elements, and there's some really strong element cards that you can pick up and do want to pick up early, and that's going to be it's going to be class dependent. Again, I'd recommend going and checking out the Fab TCG articles on each archetype of each hero in this format. There's some really good indications of cards that are high priority early, and we did also talk about some of them in the set review. But just to like recap, there's like cards like Red Autumn's Touch or an Electrify, Ball Lightning, cards like this that are element specific, but are still powerful cards and keep you open. Cool. What are we going next? I think we should talk about equipment. It's something that's very important, and in this set, super important, because in Tales of Aria there is less equipment than in any other set because the amulets do take up the equipment slot, which is really interesting for draft, where you can have tables with like people with one piece of equipment pretty regularly, people with two pieces of equipment, and it's actually really difficult in the sealed format to have 4 pieces of equipment. When I see people flip up 4 pieces of equipment in sealed, I'm like, oh, you're running hot today, because it's very unlikely, just based on the fact you have class specific equipment, you have element specific equipment, and then you have the generics. But you also are probably likely to only open around an average of 5 equipment in a draft. So in a sealed. So it is a bit of the grail if you can do that. And in draft, it's similar, right? We're going to see less equipment at the table, and some of the equipment in this format is actually on the surface of it. You go, well, it doesn't defend, and that's kind of one of the most important things about equipment. You look at Welcome to Wraith, Ironrod equipment, Monarch Ironhide equipment. There's equipment that do defend that are important. In this set, though, it's all about the activated ability of the equipment, like Deep Blue, like Ragamuffin's hat, like the suede hides for the Runeblade.
Plume, the equipment is so strong in this set, and it goes so quickly. Like, I think most equipment does get first picked. Sometimes second picked, but it dries up so quickly. I almost never see an equipment after pack like 3 or 4, unless somebody already has the boots and there's like an unusual amount of boots in the pack that the pack that's going around, whether it be pack 1 or pack 3 or something like that. But things like Deep Blue, Plume, like these kind of Deep Blue obviously being the generic and Plume being an Earth, but Earth being open to both Old
classes,
and Briar. It is extremely high priority, and you will not see it late in the draft. I think if you are seeing it, you are getting armor late. That should definitely you should be feeling good about your future games, because you're going to have an edge for sure if people are passing armor around.
Yeah, armor can actually also be an indication of open classes as well. Interestingly, like if you table, so you wheel, you get say you open a pack and it has a suede hides in it, and you get that suede hides all the way back. Probably it's very unlikely that there's 3 or 4 suede hides open at a table, although I know Brendan's actually referring to a draft where that's happened, where we've both been in. But it's very unlikely that in that pack 1 there's been multiple suede hides open, and it's a powerful card. Like, it's a card that people are going to prioritize, or even maybe a bit more of a signal would be like Plume. If that comes back after 8 picks and is still in the pack, probably there's very, very few people looking to Earth. So especially to your left, where they've just had picks, 7, 6, and 5, so they've had the later picks, and they're not taking a Plume, could be a good signal. So to just want to kind of say about equipment is important. It is something that you do need to draft. Obviously, it feels a bit weird when you sort of start to draft, because it's not a card that goes into your deck, so it's taking up a spot. But equipment are really powerful, right? And you do need these and do want them.
It's better than a spot in your deck. It's exactly. A permanent on the field.
It's just hard.
If I could draft all permanents on the field, I think I might do that. If they attacked and stuff like that. But if permanents on the field are extremely strong in Flesh and Blood. Yeah,
it's just hard. I think it's kind of counterintuitive when you start the game a little bit, though, because you're thinking about like the best sort of like 30 cards you can have and how those work together, and you're like having to, because to get equipment you're probably going to have to take them pretty highly, right? So I would say, like, in this format, after picks like 4 or 5, you're probably not seeing any equipment unless it's like a class or element like duplicate.
Like you said, a duplicate, one that's already gone around. Yeah,
exactly. Someone's already got it, or whatever it might be, or maybe like Ragamuffin's hat might be the generic one you see kind of go the latest. But even then, right, if you are probably having to take something like a Deep Blue, for instance, over like one of the best class cards in order to do it potentially in the pack, right? Like you you could have a ball lightning, and you might need to be taking the deep blue over it to ensure you get a chest piece of equipment, because you're not gonna see another one come by.
Yeah, I think the deep blue might be the most like the biggest snap pick card that has ever existed in this game.
It's
Because it's just
very
like
good.
that's just where you want to be. Like pack one, like where else is better than deep blue? It goes into everything. It's fantastic in everything.
Yeah, it's interesting, and we're getting a little bit into the weeds, but I enjoy it. The fact that like deep blue, because we're in a set that doesn't have generics, right? So you have the elemental cards that are the generics, but they're not great, to be honest, and they're also focused on elements. So like Entwine Earth, Entwine Lightning.
Yeah.
They're still focused on elements, for the most part. Obviously, you have like Rejuvenate.
Yeah. What about my Rejuvenate deck?
Yeah,
huh?
you can have that, man. It's all yours. I'll pass them all the way. Unless it's a blue and I need some resources or I need a non-attack action or whatever. But yeah, so you do have that aspect. Whereas in other formats, you have generics. You can take those, right?
Yeah. Not an option here. That's the thing is like that kind of goes back to our argument of diversity in the early picks is that every pick that you make is pretty much committal in
Except
this
Deep
draft
Blue.
format. Yeah, I mean, and then deep blue is the exception. It breaks the rule, so I think that you should first pick it every time. Although I do regret saying that because I wish that people would pass to me pick 3 or pick 4. It'd be incredible.
I can't think off the top of my head, but I'm almost certain there's probably cards that I'm going to take over a deep blue because I'm a big fan of and we've kind of talked about this already in draft, but I am a fan of taking powerful cards early. And if I don't end up playing them, I don't end up playing them. Like that's if I have a 50% chance to play like one of the best cards in the format, I'm probably just going to take that. Like in Monarch Soul Reaping, for example, I would just snap pick that first pick because I thought it was or V for the Vanguard. I thought they were two of the best cards in the format. I would just even if I only had a 25% chance to play them, I'm going to take them because the 25% chance to play one of the best cards in the format and one of the most sort of like defining cards in my deck, I think is more than enough for me.
It's interesting because I think that I would take a deep blue over a Soul Reaping or a V because I think that deep blue is the best card in the format.
Do you think the deep blue is more powerful?
Yeah, I think it's the most powerful card. It depends, but it really is just so strong at what it does, especially for your deck. Because it just fixes we're talking about a tempo heavy format, a format that can often last 4 to 5 turns. It's where else do you want to be than having a permanent on the field that will fix a hand that because if you do draw the all red hand, in most games of Tales of Aria, you're done. That's it. You're not coming back. And it's tough, especially if you're at a lower life threshold, getting around that 10. So that's why I value Deep Blue so highly. I think that if there was a Via the Vanguard equivalent, I'd probably first pick Deep Blue over it in this format.
It's funny. I think
that's just me.
I think Deep Blue encourages some interesting deck building decisions that I think are still incorrect.
I think that for me, I'm not talking about using it to skimp on my deck building, but I definitely want to reduce the variance of getting a bad
I agree
hand
on that. Yeah, I agree, and that's the strength of Deep Blue is to help reduce variance, which is massive. Anyway, we digress. Let's talk a bit about sorting as you go. So this is kind of a pretty easy rule of thumb, really, and something that just easy to focus on. Once you pick up your pack, whether it be your first pack 15 cards or it be you've already picked 5 cards from the pack, you're picking up 7 cards from your right. Just do a quick little sort. It's really easy to do. Pull the cards to the front that you're most interested in. It helps you evaluate them against each other rather than flicking through the pack and being oh, I like this card at the back and I like this card at the front, and then having to fan them out and look through them. Just pull the cards that you're interested to the front, and just sort some of them. So if Earth is an element that you're looking at, how many Earth cards are in the pack? Pull them to the front or pull them to the back or whatever. Do the same with Lightning. I wouldn't suggest sorting the entire pack as you go every single time. That's going to be very time intensive, and you're not going to actually have time to focus on thinking about the cards you want to take. But some of the key things. So if we talk about Tales of Aria, sort out the Earth cards if you're interested in those. If there's only 1 Earth card or no Earth cards in the pack, that's probably a reasonable signal. Whereas if you pull out 3 Earth cards, okay, there's 3 Earth cards here. That's a pretty reasonable signal. Or even for class cards, right? Same thing. Pull out the class cards. Maybe the 2 classes that you could be across because you have drafted Earth early, for instance. So pull out your Oldheim and your Briar. Take a look at those. So really easy to do, and just can give you some good information about what's happening around the table, but also just help you evaluate the cards that are sitting right in front of you.
Yep, and then just kind of like slightly off topic. I think it's on topic. So when I am finished with that pack, I do give it a wee shuffle before I give it to the person sitting to my left. But also every time I receive a pack to my right, I count the cards because I think that 20+% of my drafts, somebody's messed up the card. Not in professional level drafts, but at locals or something like that. But you should it's such a good habit to get into because trying to rewind from that crap is really, really annoying. So I always count the cards that are passed to me, whether, before I pick up the pack.
Yeah. I mean, just a good thing to talk about right now is just be sensible in your drafts. One of the worst things you can do is be like piling up packs to the person on your left. If they haven't taken the pack, if there's a pack sitting, you've already passed a pack, and the person to your left still picking from the previous pack, there's no point in you picking up, drafting another card, and passing it and just piling it up. Especially, if you're at maybe a local event with players who are newer to the game or less competitively minded. Just give them the opportunity to pick their cards. Don't pile stuff up to their right. This is where confusion can happen. They can take the wrong pack, that's not meant to be picked until 3 packs later because they've got 4 packs sitting to their right, things like that. So often commonly referred to as a zone draft, but very very easy to do. Just if there's not a pack to your left, then pass the pack, and if there is, just hold that pack and just wait. It's the easiest way to do it and the cleanest way to do it. But also, count your cards. It's very easy to do. All right, Brendan, should we move through into some tips on improving at drafting, some things that can definitely help you, I think, get better at drafting in Flesh and Blood?
Let's go. Send it.
Send it? All right. The first one is draft your seat. So this is a concept that we're kind of talking about when we talk about improving a draft. And draft your seat basically means that there is very likely going to be a certain deck or a certain hero or class or set of elements that end up best positioned for the seat you're in. And this is what you should try and draft as much as possible. This is like a concept which basically says, don't force anything, find the open class, the open element, and draft your seat. So just to give an example of what this could look like. So let's say we go through the first 5 cards in a pack, and we're hedging. To Brendan's point, maybe we've taken 2 from one element, 2 from another element, and 1 from a third element, or maybe even a class card because it's really strong and we want to hedge it. Now we're starting to get to the point where you can start to read signals, right? You can start to feel like what is coming your way, especially as the pack starts to wheel. So as we get through the first 8 cards, that's what I mean by the wheel. The pack's gone around the table. You get to see the cards that you opened in pack 1. Now you can start to make some connections about what is happening. This is when you can start to read signals from your right, which classes or which element might be open from your right, and then that's when you should make the decision in your seat to decide where you should be. And effectively, right, Brendan, is one of the biggest things is like don't force and try and stay open to a degree that you could move into the drafting your seat sort of mentality. So if I started drafting all Briar cards, and actually this is something I did in my last draft to see how this would go, and it went really poorly and sort of confirmed some thoughts that I had. But I actually hedged, like some really powerful Briar cards early, class cards, and then my draft seat ended up actually being, I should have been in like an Ice Lexi deck is what I should have been in, because that's the class cards and the element cards that I was passed. But I was so committed to this Briar deck because I had no hedge picks. I had no lightning cards that could fit into a Lexi deck. I had no ice cards that could fit in there. I had a bunch of class cards and not many element cards. I was like shackled to this one archetype.
Yeah, I mean that's definitely a cute story, but the reality of it is that you were sitting to the left of old B Pat, and I was just pulling Jedi mind tricks on you, forcing you into the briars. I cut you.
Yeah,
no, but I mean it's a good tip. Like staying open and kind of drafting safety is better. I mean, I know in our first draft, because the caliber of player, I perceived it to be quite high. I did test out forcing in this. In Tales of Aria, just to see if it was something that was viable, and it was definitely the worst, the worst thing I've done so far. Just because, I mean, what are you forcing, right? You forcing class cards? It's like, you're probably going to be wanting to pick up the element cards early anyway, because there's like a plethora of class cards usually later, because almost everybody drafts. Excuse me, drafts element to class.
Yeah. I was going to say as well, and. It kind of Brennan points in a big sort of thing there, but sometimes you can have a player to your right who just can't send signals, and so you're gonna have to be prepared for that. It does happen, believe me. No, I'm kidding.
There's levels to the signals.
Yeah, of course there is. No, so I did want to talk about just what how to draft your seat. So we've talked about what it is. That way to draft your seat is to stay somewhat open. You can hedge, you can take some good class cards, but have the ability to stay open, especially in Tales of Aria. I think in other sets, you can stay open a lot cleaner with generics and take some class cards, or take like a shadow card still leaves you, just as open as an element, but you can also tie that in with generics, whereas this, you need to be really careful about the amount of class cards you take, because also it turns out some element cards might not be playable in your deck, depending on which hero you end up in. So although they keep you open to a degree, it's only to, a slight degree. So that's one of the ways you can draft your seat. The next is to, to be ready to jump in and abandon. So as soon as you hit that sort of, the wheel, those 8 cards coming around, you start to get a bit of information. So like, I opened 2 ice cards in this pack, and both ice cards are still in this pack. Like, there's no one drafting ice, or even if you opened, 1 and there's still another ice card there, and it's a strong ice card. Like maybe it's a yellow ice quake or something. Like that's still a good signal that maybe only one player has sort of started to prioritize ice, and probably not anyone immediately to your right. That could be a signal to maybe start jumping in. And drafting your seat means also you want to react to some degree, but you also want to you don't want to make immediate decisions. So I start to get some information from the wheel. I start to think maybe ice might be open, and then a couple of Lexi cards start to come. Strong, like red arrows late. Okay, I'm going to take a couple of these. I'm still open to some degree. If I get to pack, the end of pack 1, maybe it's like picks 11 and 12, and it turns out like the Lexi cards that I saw on the first cycle round are no longer in the deck, no longer in the pack. So, the cards I saw picks 2, 3, and 4 on the wheel, those Lexi cards are no longer in there. Then actually maybe Lexi isn't as open as I thought it was going to be. Someone to my right has moved into it instead of me. If I'm drafting my seat, I can still pivot back out of that Lexi deck that I was thinking I needed to draft. Ice might still be really open, but it might be that you end up in an all-time deck, right? So drafting your seat means also being able to just react through that first pack and find out where you should be.
Yeah, and we touched on this earlier as well, but drafting power cards early is an effective strategy, but coupled with that is being ready to abandon them.
100%.
So like, if you're drafting your seat, even if you do pick up, extremely strong cards, like let's say you do pick up an early plume or something like that, but then you see the earth is drawn up, just don't be afraid to kind of jump out of that. And then, if you're going into the open class or the open element, you're going to have a better deck anyway, most of the time.
Yeah, you're going to get rewarded for it, which is the biggest thing. Like there's this, you get really attached to your earlier picks because they're like the best cards in the pack. You had the whole pack to pick from, and you chose Plume because it's one of the best cards, or you chose Red Bull Lightning because it's one of the strongest cards in the pack. But you know what? Like you abandoning that pack and drafting your seat, abandoning your power cards, you're actually, if you've done it correctly and you've found that soft spot in the draft, you're gonna get paid double, triple time back in packs 2 and 3 because you've found the spot that you need to be in.
Mm-hmm.
Reflect on your draft, right? This is something that you can definitely do as you go along. So when you're drafting, there's going to be points in the pack or in any of the packs where you go, oh, this is a tough pick. If we're talking about drafting your seat again, maybe there's a point where you could be pivoting and maybe you decide not to pivot. So maybe I take the extra Briar card and I pass the Ice card. I decide that actually it still feels like Briar's open. It feels like maybe I should have pivoted here. Not sure. I'm going to stick to my guns. You can go back on the draft afterwards and just think about that. Like, well, what ended up happening? Well, actually, I should have been in Ice. I should have been here. I ended up just really sticking to my guns with these Briar cards, and they ended up being 4 Briar drafters at the table, but they had prioritized elements early, and that's why I got a lot of good Briar cards, and I just got so cut from elements. My deck just ended up being so poor. This is a specific experience, actually, that happened to me, right? So you can reflect on your draft afterwards and go like, where were the points that went wrong? Where were the points that went well? Maybe in that exact same situation, you actually pivot. You decide to start taking the red arrows, even though you have no Lexi cards so far, because it feels like that's the set you're meant to be in and that's what you're being fed from your right. And then, you end up with a great Ice Lexi deck in the end, and you can reflect on that point as the point where you made that decision. There's lots of things like that you can do during the draft. There's other picks you could go back on. Pack 1, pick 1. I took a plume over a strong class card. Things like this. You can go back and sort of reflect on them.
Yeah, 100%. Well, Hayden, let's go close this one out and let's talk about some advanced concepts here.
Yeah. So I kind of just, because we've already talked about this, we talked about reading signals, right? But I did just want to kind of detail a little bit more about like what reading and sending signals kind of means in the context of a Flesh and Blood draft. And that is basically like just, signaling, right? So like you would use a signal at an intersection, although some people, prefer not to use those and just assume you have telepathy. If you're passing to your left and you early on in the pack are passing really strong earth cards because you've taken some good ice, maybe a good ranger card, maybe a really solid piece of equipment, you've taken deep blue, you are sending a signal to some degree. You are saying to the person on your left that you haven't taken these earth cards. Whether you're saying that earth is open or not, that's neither here nor there. You have passed really strong earth cards to your left, so they're probably, if they're some of the best cards in the pack, they're probably going to take them, right? So you very likely could be signaling and putting someone on your left into earth. So that's just something that you need to consider for pack 2, because in pack 2, the earth cards probably aren't going to come your way if you end up deciding in pack 1, actually, I do want to be in a hero that wants earth, or I do want earth cards. So there is some signal, but more than sending signals, and that is sending signals, reading signals is much more important, right, Brendan?
Yep, 100%. So, hey, talk to me about this. I'm a new drafter, right? Tell me what the wheel is. Like, okay, let's say I understand what you're saying. You say wheel the card, you see the pack that you saw originally, see what's in there. What if I can't remember that? Like, what if that's just too much for me? I'm focused on trying to build a deck. I'm not even looking at it. I'm thinking about my ratios, thinking about my class, thinking about so many other things. What do I need? Like, is there any kind of shortcut you can give me so when that pack does come back around, like, what's gonna
sit you up? Oh, you bet, yeah.
Exactly, pretty much. So, like, how do I do that the easy way? Do you have any tips to be able to identify the packs that you've seen before and then look, see things that should jump out at you, right? Like there is the plume is still in there or something crazy. The card we've referenced a million times this podcast.
Yeah, you don't need to have photographic memory. You don't remember exactly which cards were in that pack, but okay, there's a couple of things you can do, right? The first is when the pack wheels around, so it comes around the table, it's gone through 7 other players and it's come back to you. Whether it be the first pack you saw, the fourth pack you saw. The first thing that you can do is just be like, what are the strongest cards in this pack? And, if there's, to your point, there's a plume or there's multiple strong class cards in the pack, that's kind of your first tip off, right? The next stage of that is if you had a little bit of ability because you've done a lot of drafts, you've been practicing this format, some things are a bit more sort of, come naturally to you. Maybe when you opened your first 3 packs, you just made a mental note of some of like the really key cards in there. Like, oh, actually, there's like 3 really good Briar cards in here. I wonder if I might be able to wheel one of these back around the table and get it back. And then you get one of them back. And you kind of remember, like, you don't need to be like, oh, it was a yellow Veiler Flash, it was a red, whatever. But if you remember there was 3 strong Briar cards in that first pack and you get back to your 9th pick, so you see your pack again, and there's still, 1 or 2 of those strong Briar cards, that could be a signal, right? That could be something that's being told to you at the table, potentially. I think to our earlier point, this is more prevalent in elements because people are going to try and draft elements in Tales of Aria earlier. But you can still take some notes from this. So those are kind of easy ways to do it. If you can remember exactly what those cards are, then good on you. I think it's really difficult to do. I personally am more just someone who remembers like kind of the idea of the cards, the classes, the elements as they go around. But the more information you have at your disposal, if you're able to do it, the better.
So I know this will come as a shock to our audience, but I want to talk about drafting archetypes. And there was an archetype back in Welcome to Wraith actually called Yellow Bellow. I know, it's just a meme because I've said it so many times. But let's talk about drafting archetypes, what that means. Obviously, Jason Chung, he just put up an article, and in that article, you can see Pinger's Briar, right? Which is funny that was detailed in the articles, because I actually think that was already the most contested archetype in draft, was that exact archetype. Being other examples of this, like Prism Shields, like Levio Recursion with like the How, Go See Visit, Unworldly, all that good stuff. So it's hard to tell you to draft an archetype because they're just incredibly elusive in Flesh and Blood. And once you find them, that's kind of, in my mind, that's how you crack the format, right? So I don't have a lot on hand. I definitely did try one in our last draft. I tried drafting a lot of Earth cards, and I had like quite a few Entwined Earths. Yeah, so I took Entwine Earth with the kind of idea of the deck being to arsenal a pump card, whether it's Weave Earth or Earth or Surge, then have another pump card and Entwine Earth, and then a resource card, block with one card on my turn, and then come in with Entwine Earth, fuse it with the card in my hand, and maybe if I could have that arsenal, play the pump before it, and every turn would be 8 plus damage, 8 to 13 damage, while I'm kind of effectively blocking with one card, maybe two if I had to. So that was definitely an archetype I tried to find, and I think there's a lot kind of on the horizon, especially in this set. It's such a synergy-based set. But before I get too ahead of myself, Hayden, tell me what an archetype is.
Yeah, Brendan, very passionate about the archetypes, and I think to your point, there's going to be a ton in Tales of Aria because of like the synergistic nature of the set, right, and how elements and fuse cards interact. But effectively, we've been talking about archetypes the whole pod. Archetypes are just they are certain decks or types of decks within the draft that look very similar to one another that you can probably repeatedly draft with a few rules of thumb of the cards. They're going to be like a set of key cards that interact with one another. So a good example is like the Levia Recursion deck from Monarch. So it was an archetype that really focused around a game plan of recurring threats from your banish zone, thanks to banishing cards from your graveyard into your banish zone, playing cards like Howl from Beyond, or even like Ghostly Visit out of your banish zone repeatedly, with like one or two card hands. And that effectively meant that, okay, well, here's an archetype. This is the way that this deck wants to play out. And I know that because I want to try and draft this archetype, or it feels like this archetype is open, there's key cards I know I need. So certain cards become much higher priority in order to draft that archetype. If you go and look at the article that Brennan's referencing there, the Jason Chung Briar one on Fab TCG, Jason talks about this. Some of the cards that are really important to Briar that you want to prioritize early if you want to draft a certain archetype of Briar, rather than just draft Briar. And archetypes are really kind of the move on step in drafting. Once you get into thinking about archetypes and being conscious of trying to draft these strategies, you can be a lot more cohesive in your drafting. Cards become, rather than just, the best card in the pack, or it's an earth card, or it's a class card, you're thinking about, this card contributes to the archetype I'm trying to draft. This card doesn't. So this card has a lot higher standing in the sort of draft order for me currently. And that's when you get into like pick orders, right? Which is like, which cards are better than others, which cards have higher grades, which cards are better in certain decks. So that's kind of where archetypes comes in. And it's definitely a very advanced concept of drafting, but it's one that once you start to get to it is really fun and enjoyable, but is also probably going to really elevate your draft game.
Yeah, 100%.
Cool. I think we're kind of closing it out, really. I think that's our kind of base intro in some ways to draft. Draft is such a deep part of Flesh and Blood. There's so many things we could talk about. We did, we got into some Tales of Aria specific things, and to be honest, we could probably just talk about Tales of Aria draft for hours on end, but we did want to give a bit of an overview of drafting. Obviously, we're coming into the Skirmish Season 3, we're coming into Nationals draft. There's some really key fundamentals that we've shared here, as well as some ways to we think get better at drafts, and some sort of tips and things to keep in mind to make sure that when you get to that 8-man table, that 8-person draft table, that you can really crush it and find your seat, as it were, might be one of the things that you try and do.
Awesome. Well, as we close out, I do want to mention that we do have a YouTube channel. I know it's surprising, but yeah, we've obviously had a huge focus on YouTube. We mentioned we hit 2,000 subscribers, which is amazing. So on YouTube, we do all kinds of stuff other than this pod, right? We have the supplemental pod, which is Time in the Round, which we've recently switched the format to. It's very, every single week we'll be having a guest on. Our next week's guest is actually Carol Ruskowitz. I think that's how you say his last name, from Legendary Studios, and the infamous Brute player out of New Zealand. So super excited to have him on. So in addition to Time of the Round, we also do deck techs, we do gameplay, all kinds of stuff. So go check it out. That's Arsenal Pass on YouTube. And also, like I always say, the boomers have welcomed Wraith have found their ways on Twitter. So I am located at the Fiddy Shades. I'm probably going to be switching that soon. I think it's a little hard to remember. And Hayden is at Fyendale, so FYEN_Dale, like his last name. And in closing, of course, big thank you to the Patreons, closing in at 200. The support is amazing, absolutely allows us to do what we do, and we're going to be pushing it so much further in the future because, of all the success we've seen and all the support we've gotten, and just can't say thank you enough. Like we said, if you're interested in the Patreon, lots of exclusive content, all the sideboard guides, deck stuff, everything you need to. If we put up a deck tech, take that deck, go be competitive, and go start winning with it. Then plenty of more content on the podcast side, whether that's the additional podcast every month or the additional live session on top of that every month, where you can participate live with us, ask questions, see us on camera, all that good stuff. But anyway, we hope you enjoyed this episode. We'll see you next week.
See you later, guys.